Hello, AP World History students. I'm coming to you today to talk about imperialism. This is chapter 20 in our textbook. Take a look at this picture here. We will look at it more closely in class, but this man is named Cecil Rhodes. He was actually involved in colonizing a large part of South Africa. But take a look at the imagery here. Like I said, we'll talk about it in class, but look at the objects. Look at where he's standing. Look at the position that he has. Look at the items in his hand and on his uniform. So let's start by talking about and actually defining imperialism. Imperialism is defined as the domination of other countries over subject lands for profit and advantage. And Cecil Rhodes actually said this: "We are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Now, he truly, truly believed this, as did many Europeans and probably white Americans at the time as well. And the era that we're entering into was a very, very difficult time for many people in the world. When we think of imperialism, just think you're in your home, and then some country says, "But I want that home." And so then they have to come in and they have to take control. So it's one thing for these different Europeans to claim that they controlled a land and then to take control itself. And so we'll sort of be talking about the differences between those two things as we go through this chapter. Motivations for imperialism were many. First of all, as with many things, geopolitical significance was one of the motivations for imperialism. So access to waterways, to rivers, to supply stations, and even some imperial rivalries. Maybe if France and England wanted the same place, or the Netherlands and England, they could carry out these rivalries that they had both in Europe, in other lands as well. Another reason for imperialism, of course, was economic. As you know, Europe is industrializing rapidly, and they need natural resources, and they can also benefit from the cheap labor that they would get by exploiting people that lived in the places that they were colonizing, which they definitely did. They also could potentially expand markets, so perhaps the places that they're colonizing will want to actually buy some of the manufactured goods that they were making. We specifically have rubber in the Congo. Rubber was very important for the machines of the Industrial Revolution. We have copper, of course, a metal that is important in making the machines, and tin in Southeast Asia as well, a lighter metal that is used in industrial processes. Another driving factor behind imperialism was the idea that many Christians had that they should continue to spread Christianity around the world. Now, we talked about the fact that early on in 1600s, as global trade was beginning, that it was primarily Jesuits. Now we're talking about primarily Protestant missionaries that are believing that they need to bring the word to Africa and to Asia. Okay, so sorry about the little brief interruption there. Scientific racism and social Darwinism was a movement that arose out of the ideas of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin talked about natural selection and evolution. Social Darwinism and scientific racism basically came out of the ideas of natural selection, and that whites were believed to be superior by many people. And even in the field that I teach and I love, psychology, scientific racism had a huge thrust in the early 20th century in psychology. In fact, the term intelligence quotient comes from psychology trying to define superior people that could breed and then hopefully speed up the process of evolution by making smarter and better people. Social Darwinism, then, that idea that the whites were superior, that would provide justification for colonization. After all, as is stated in the poem White Man's Burden that we will look at more closely in class, it was the duty of European and Euro-American peoples to bring order and enlightenment to distant lands. So, of course, this was a really dominant belief system throughout much of Europe and America, and one obviously that we'll need to explore a little bit more. Okay, tools to aid imperialism. So first of all, transportation had advanced tremendously with the advent of the steam engine, and so now we have steamships that can actually travel without the aid of the wind. We have railroads that are also run by steam. Additionally, we have canals now being built, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, making ship transport much, much quicker. You don't have to go around South Africa or South America anymore to get from one place to the other. We have new weapons, and probably one of the most important ones was the fully automatic weapon. This picture right here is actually Hiram Maxim. He made the first fully automatic machine gun, and you can see the bullets sort of coming down from the chamber. And basically, the colonizers, as they were trying to take over the lands that they were colonizing, would if they didn't feel like the people were going to be of any use of them, they basically just killed them. And I read some really horrifying accounts of trying to colonize lands where they only wanted the resource, they didn't want the people. And finally, we have communications have sped up. We have the telegraph, again, the faster sea travel, and correspondence is going to make it easier for a company, for example, or a government leader to carry out their plans for colonization. All right, so if we take a look at imperialism in Asia here, I think this gives you a good idea who the colonizers were. So India was colonized by Great Britain. France was colonized Southeast Asia over here, and eventually we'll have there will be a war that the U.S. is involved in, the Vietnam War, and it is this area involves Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Japan colonized Korea, and there were actually Koreatowns in Japan as well. So there were areas where Koreans were required to live in Japan. The United States, we've got our hands in the Philippines here, and of course in Hawaii, which is not on this map. The Netherlands, over here, the Dutch East Indies Trading Company, VOC, was very dominant in the Dutch East Indies. And then we have Portugal has just this little area of Timor. Russia comes up here, butts up against Korea later on in the 1950s. The United States will fight a war in Korea as China invades Korea, actually. But at this time, Russia is close to the Chinese border. The British Empire in India, wow. First of all, it started out as just being a concessionary company rule. So the East India Company had permission from the Prime Minister and the royalty to conduct business in India at their will. So they could make laws, they could direct what kind of trade went on, etc. They did end up having the monopoly on the Indian trade, and if you look at the key at the top right, you'll see that all of India came under control of Britain, with the exception of this very, very small area here, which was Portuguese territory. Originally, the Mughal emperors were kind of weak and didn't have a great deal of centralized control to begin with, and so they gave permission to the East India Company to come in and sort of take care of affairs. But political conquest ensues. The Mughals, don't want them there anymore, but the East India Company wants to protect its economic interests. So does Great Britain. So Great Britain actually they draft Indian troops, or what are called sepoys, into their military, and they did eventually take over all of India. India became dependent on British goods as the industry grows in India and in Great Britain. One of the things that the people of India in particular liked to have was the power loom cotton, which is much smoother. It's a smaller thread count. It's more comfortable. It's cooler. And homespun is what they had in India. So they didn't have the power looms. They grew the cotton. The cotton would go to England, and then they would bring it back and buy it back in the form of cloth. The Sepoy Revolt was a really, really important situation that occurred in India. So Indian and the Sepoy troops were Indian. They were Muslim and they were Hindu. And when they got the cartridges, the bullets and the ammunition, they were wrapped in wax paper. And the wax, as it turns out, was made from pork or beef fat in big vats, and they boiled down the fat to make it like oil, and then they put the paper in, and then they pulled it out, let it, sort of dry, let the oil soak into the paper. And the reason why they wrapped the ammunition in these wax papers was so that they wouldn't rust. So once the ammunition was delivered, the Sepoy troops would actually bite off the end of the paper to get the ammunition out of the paper. But then they found out, oh my gosh, these are wrapped in fat. And both the Hindus and the Muslims were horrified because this was so against their belief system. And they really felt like they had betrayed the customs of their faith. So they staged a small scale rebellion at a garrison. But this led to a general anti-British revolution that would last about a year and a half. And the British gained the upper hand in late 1857. It officially ended in 1858, and this led to direct rule of India by the British. Casualty count, 6,000 British, 800,000 Indians. So clearly they were outnumbered and outfought. By the way, this picture right here shows what happened to some of the rebels. They were actually tied. You can see their hands are tied, their feet are tied to a cannon, and then they blast the cannon through the individuals to send a message to the others not to engage in any of that kind of activity. So I'm going to stop there right now and hope that this video makes it to YouTube. I tried earlier today and I didn't make it, so I'm hoping for this one. Thanks, and be looking for part 2.